These are the texts for the fifth Sunday of Lent, which will be March the 17th. Easter comes early this year. The following Sunday after the 17th, the 24th, will be Palm Sunday. So we're shifting our focus a little bit beginning this week. Yes, we're still dealing with the frailty of humanity, which is a big theme in Lent. But we're also shifting the focus a little bit from human frailty into beyond frailty, into beyond suffering. The sort of an optimism that comes not in spite of suffering, but through and beyond the suffering. The first text is from Jeremiah, the 31st chapter. And beginning about the chapter before, there's a different tone in Jeremiah. And this tone now becomes one of hope and optimism. This text from Jeremiah 31 to 34, which ends that section, is this great sense about what God is going to be doing. Now, what is fascinating about it, Jeremiah is in prison when suddenly his tone changes. And why is he in prison? Because he's been warning the people of Jerusalem that bad things are about to happen, that the Babylonian Empire is about to overrun them, and that they're going to be captured and put in prison. And he's even told the king, he said, you know, you're going to be captured and you're going to see the king of Babylon in Babylon, eyeball to eyeball. So the king throws Jeremiah in prison. Now, while he's in prison and while Babylon is knocking at the gate, Jeremiah changes his tune in an interesting way. And he says that the day is going to come when the people are going to return. They're going to buy and sell goods again. They're going to buy property, and they're going to plant crops and so forth and so on. And to back up what he now sees in a hopeless situation to be the future promise of God made good, he buys a field. And you can move on through through chapter 31 into chapter 32, which is where he actually buys the field while he's in prison, in this optimism. Now, what's fascinating about Jeremiah's optimism, he's literally doing it as a symbol of the future, because he already knows that the captivity is going to last 70 plus years. So he won't be around to actually enjoy the benefit of this purchase he's going to make. But there's a wonderful description in there of calling together witnesses, of making the exchange of payment, and of the proper way of taking the scroll and putting it in a clay jar so that it can be preserved until such time as the people return. So does this mean that Jeremiah had some cousins or children or grandchildren? Don't know. But he buys a field from a current cousin, knowing that the promises of God are going to be fulfilled in some future time. And he knows he's not going to be around to see it. He seems to intimate that this promise is not coming in spite of the suffering that is taking place and will take place, but through it, as though there is a cleansing that is occurring as a result of the suffering. That's a good thing to remember. You know, when you think about a lot of the life lessons that we learn along the way, it's quite often when things don't go our way, whatever that may mean at the moment. It's not necessarily physical suffering. It can certainly be emotional suffering or disappointment. But it's often that when things don't go our way, that at the end of that, we have learned better lessons. We have become better people, wiser people, more caring, more thoughtful of others, or more insightful about life in general. So that theme is beginning to happen here with Jeremiah, that everybody's going to come back at some point. The land is going to be renewed, and the people of God will be under a new covenant. This is the first and only place this notion of new covenant is really highlighted in the Old Testament. Suggests the new covenant that Jesus speaks of, the new covenant in my blood. It's also that the law will be written on their hearts. Now, we think of hearts as the seat of emotion. They thought of heart as the seat of the will. There may be something worth playing with on that, that it will be written on their hearts. It will be written in their will, their willful intent. That speaks a little bit about sanctification, does it not? To where we find ourselves compelled to do the right things. We often talk about that in the Christian faith, justification by faith and sanctification. That compulsion to reach out and to do things for others. That doesn't come from within. We don't exactly know. What Jeremiah would say was, it's because the Lord has written his law on your wills, on your hearts. So that's the text there. His optimism in the face of nothing optimistic, but beyond his optimism, his confidence that this great day will come through the suffering that the people now experience. The psalm for this coming Sunday is the same psalm that was on Ash Wednesday. Always comes up at this time of year. Psalm 51. It's not a very long psalm, so I always encourage you to read all the way through to the end of it. Although the lectionary text stops at verse 12, it does give us this sequence of the psalmist recognizing his own frailty, weakness, sinfulness, his own desire to be cleansed, and then at the end, this sense of hope and even awareness of the new life to come as the result of all that he's been through. We might say it's, well, let me say it this way. Some people would say it's because he's asked for forgiveness. Yeah, okay, maybe so. But I think it may be more comprehensive than that. It is because precisely of his sinful nature, the destructive sense that his sinful nature has caused in him or with others, that brings him into a period of disappointment and suffering and a plea to God for cleansing, and then the optimism that comes. Again, this sense of a move through frailty, a move through suffering into something stronger and more pleasing in the sight of God. So I won't say any more about Psalm 51. You can look at it again. It's one of those that we know verses of so well, and probably the verse that comes best to mind is, "Create in me a clean spirit, O God," which comes not at the beginning of the psalm, but down a little ways in the psalm. The Hebrews text, Hebrews chapter 5, gives us an insight into the humanity of Christ in a way that maybe no other place in the New Testament does. It is as though our unknown writer in the book of Hebrews has a sense that one cannot overemphasize the humanity of Christ. You know, we all like to talk about Jesus as both divine and human, and typically we tend to err on the side of his divinity and often to the exclusion of his genuine humanity. Well, the book of Hebrews simply won't allow us to do that. Chapter 5 says this remarkable piece in verse 8. Although Jesus was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. Wow. And having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. Now, if Jesus was truly human, then everything I have just said about growing through suffering, insight through suffering, wisdom through suffering, sympathy and empathy through suffering, also pertains to Jesus. That perfection was not just sinlessness. Perfection was in living a human life and suffering all the things that we do. Disappointments, not being picked to be on the team, the last kid to be picked, or whatever the situation was in your own life. Not making the highest grade in the class when you worked so hard, or pick all the things from being a little child on up. One of the things that used to occur in my life, I was the oldest of 5, and my youngest brother, who's 8.5 years younger, when we were all adults and both of my parents were still alive, at some point said, when we were growing up, you all, meaning all of us older ones, used to get blamed for a lot of things that I did. And I think I knew that, although usually when I was being scolded, I figured somehow I was at the root of why I was being scolded. But all of the things that make for a human life, this text is trying to indicate that all the way even into and through the point of Jesus' death, his sufferings are being utilized, are being causing him to be made perfect in the sight of God. So perfection beyond sinlessness, this genuine sense, and our writer of Hebrews is trying to find his way to say, yep, he knows everything about being a human, and he understands our deep inmost being because he has been there himself. A very powerful notion. It's not one that we ought to slight in any way, particularly at the season of Lent when we think of human frailty. We ought also to think about Christ's own frailty. Now, the text ends with something that I've never spent much time with, and I'll give you just a brief allusion here. It says, having been made perfect through suffering and so forth, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, having been designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Well, you'll have to go back to the story of Abram before he becomes Abraham, I believe, to learn something about King Melchizedek, who was king of Salem, king of peace, king of Shalom, but a community named Salem, perhaps the community of Jerusalem itself, Yarusalam. But the notion of being in Melchizedek, the writer of Hebrews doesn't explain in chapter 5, but over in chapter 7 he begins to speak of it. And this is where, again, he clearly is addressing people of the Hebrew culture, people of probably the Hebrew race. Think with me for a second. Which tribe of Israel were the designated priests? It was the Levi tribe, the tribe of Levi, the Levites, those of Levi. And who was the first of that tribe? Aaron, Moses' brother, Aaron. And in chapter 7, our writer takes pains to say that Jesus is not of that kind of a priestly line, not one that's been inherited, not one that's been passed down through the DNA. No, he is one that has been singled out and chosen, as was Melchizedek, chosen by God to be high priest. In other words, God puts his finger on the person. You're the high priest. So he's trying to distinguish that this initiative in Christ is the initiative of God, who makes this decision, who says, you are my son, who makes this decision to purify Jesus through suffering. And we can see that in Jesus' own dialogue, can we not? In the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus says, Father, let this cup pass from me. In other words, a real human being that does not want to go through what the human being knows he is about to go through. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine. So this is the act of God on the human Jesus that brings beyond his sinlessness, his perfection, in his complete understanding, having passed through all of the kinds of things that you and I pass through in human life. The good stuff, sure, but all of the difficult stuff, the suffering. Leads us to an interesting, hopeful edge when you put those elements together, I think. And that is, it reminds us all, does it not, while we all are still alive and kicking, that our own Good Friday is coming, our own moment of death is coming, and then after death, our own moment of celebration before God, as he has called us from time immemorial to be his own. Now from the Gospel of John, the 12th chapter. Interesting, so much of the book of John, in fact, some people would say that the whole book of John is just really focused on the last 2 weeks of Jesus' life. I'd say that's probably true. So much of it takes place in Jerusalem at that time, and already in chapter 12, with our text today, we are at the time of the Passover. And we know what's going to take place during that Passover time is that Jesus is going to be betrayed, put on trial, and crucified. But this is what's happening here is before that. John 20 is telling us that there were some Greeks that came for the time of Passover. Would not be unusual, God-fearers, Gentiles, Goyim, who are not of the Hebrew race, who believe in the one God of the Hebrews, Yahweh, and they come to Passover to celebrate Passover. There's already this sense that this belief and this recognition in the God who rescued the Hebrew nation is larger than just the Hebrew people, which is a fair amount different than a lot of the other nations and their gods. So these Greeks come up and they approach Philip. Philip is a Greek name, who goes and tells his brother Andrew. Andrew is a Greek name. I don't know, the text doesn't really tell us whether they knew each other or how this was, but they say they would like to see Jesus. Now, as often happens in the Gospel of John, Jesus' response don't always seem to be direct to the question, but kind of sail over the question or sail over the moment in time. And I think this one is that way, and we'll see what you think. Sir, we would see Jesus. So Philip went and told Andrew, and Andrew and Philip went to tell Jesus, and this is what Jesus says. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains a single grain, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. Those who love their life lose it. Those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, there will my servant be also. Whoever serves me, the Father will honor. Lord, these Greeks want to see you. And this is the response. Now, there's something that does connect with that. The connection begins, Jesus is already aware of the peril that awaits. When Jesus says this about a grain of wheat falling to the earth and dying, he is speaking of himself. And what happens after that grain of wheat is in the earth dying or dead? When it sprouts, it yields far more wheat than it did in its singular life. Jesus has a sense here that the suffering he is going through or about to go through is going to bear, and the death, like that grain of wheat, is going to bear enormous fruit. That it is inevitable that he must go through what he is going to go through for this enormous amount of fruit to flourish. And so it is his sense that the movement, the connection with God is going to blossom, but only after he completes his suffering. We also know that it isn't just the completion of his suffering, because the people were still at their wits' end, not knowing what to do until he appears after the resurrection. Again, always the initiative of God from the beginning on. So this is what's happening here in the text. Is Jesus, does he ever see the Greeks? We don't know. But what we do know is that in his deeply human awareness and knowing the things he's about to suffer, there is still an optimism, a hope, and beyond a hope, a confidence that God's will not only prevail, but as a direct result of the things that he as a human being is going to undergo, the promises of God will be flourishing in ways that he in this life can never quite comprehend. Only after the resurrection will he comprehend. And we might say of our own ending and new beginning, only after our own resurrection into the presence of God will we fully begin to comprehend how God maybe even has used us in this one life he has given us. I'll look forward to connecting again with you next week on Palm Sunday.